The December wind howled through the valley like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter. Samuel Hartley stood at the frost-covered window of his ranch house, watching the last of the autumn leaves surrender to the coming snow. His breath fogged the glass as he traced patterns in the condensation, the same meaningless circles he'd been drawing for 3 winters now. At 42, Samuel cut an imposing figure against the backdrop of his vast holdings, his shoulders, broad from years of breaking horses and mending fences, seemed permanently set in a defensive hunch. The silver threading through his dark beard caught the lamplight, making him look older than his years. But it wasn't age that had carved the deep lines around his eyes. It was loss, the kind that settles into a man's bones and refuses to leave. The ranch sprawled across 8,000 acres of Montana territory, nestled between the Absaroka Mountains and the wide grasslands that stretched endlessly eastward. It was an empire built with blood, sweat, and more luck than Samuel cared to admit. The cattle numbered in the thousands, the horses were the finest in 3 counties, and the bank account in Billings held enough to buy half the territory. Yet, as he stood there, watching darkness creep across his domain, Samuel Hartley felt poorer than the day he'd arrived 20 years ago, with nothing but a worn saddle and foolish dreams. The house itself testified to his success and his solitude in equal measure. Built of sturdy pine and stone, it could withstand any storm the mountains threw at it. The main room boasted a fireplace large enough to roast a whole steer, imported rugs from back east, and furniture that had cost more to ship than most men earned in a year. But dust gathered in the corners where a woman's careful hand would have banished it. The good china sat unused in the cabinet, and half the rooms remained shut, their doors closed against memories too painful to disturb. Samuel turned from the window and moved to his desk, where a letter lay waiting for his signature. He'd drafted it 3 times already, each version more terse than the last. Asterisk. To whom it may concern, at the Territorial Employment Agency, I require a cook for the winter months. Must be experienced, quiet, and willing to live at a remote location. No families. Generous wage for the right candidate. He picked up the pen, hesitated, then signed his name with quick, decisive strokes. The truth was, he didn't want anyone in his house. The last cook had lasted 2 weeks before the isolation drove him back to town, spreading tales about the hermit millionaire who barely spoke 3 words a day. Before that, there'd been old Miguel, who'd stayed 6 months before his daughter insisted he return to live with her family. Each departure reinforced what Samuel already knew: some men were meant to be alone. Outside, his foreman Jake Colton was finishing the evening rounds. Samuel watched the younger man check the barn doors, his movements efficient despite the gathering dark. Jake had been with him 8 years now, the longest any hand had stayed. He lived in the foreman's cabin a quarter-mile from the main house, close enough to respond to emergencies, but far enough to maintain the careful distance Samuel preferred. "Everything secured for the night, Mr. Hartley," Jake called out as he passed the house on his way home. Samuel raised a hand in acknowledgement through the window. Their communication rarely required more than gestures these days. As full darkness settled over the ranch, Samuel lit the oil lamps and built up the fire. The crackling flames threw dancing shadows across the walls, bringing momentary life to the empty rooms. He heated a pot of beans and salt pork, the same meal he'd eaten for the past 4 nights. Cooking for one didn't inspire creativity. After dinner, he settled into his leather chair with a glass of whiskey and a book he'd already read twice. The words blurred together as his mind wandered to winters past, when this room had rung with laughter and the scent of fresh bread filled the air. Martha would sit by the fire, her needlework in her lap, while little Emma played with her cloth dolls on the rug. He could almost hear their voices if he concentrated hard enough, but that way lay madness. The whiskey burned pleasantly as it went down, dulling the edges of memory. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending drafts through gaps in the window frames. Another storm was building in the mountains. By morning, the passes might be closed, cutting him off from town for days or even weeks. The thought should have worried him, but instead brought a perverse comfort. Nature's isolation was easier to bear than the kind he'd chosen for himself. Samuel pulled out his pocket watch, another reminder of better days. Martha had given it to him on their 5th anniversary, engraved with words he couldn't bear to read anymore. Nearly midnight. He should go to bed. But sleep came hard these days. The empty bed upstairs felt vast as an ocean, cold despite the thick quilts and warming pans. Rising stiffly from his chair, he made his rounds, checking locks that didn't need checking, banking the fire, extinguishing all but one lamp to light his way upstairs. These rituals gave shape to his days, small bulwarks against the shapeless grief that threatened to swallow him whole. In his bedroom, he paused at the window that faced east toward town. 15 miles of rough road separated him from the nearest neighbor, 30 to Billings itself. The distance had been Martha's only complaint about the ranch. "It's so far from everything," she'd said when they first arrived. "What if something happens?" He'd laughed then, young and invincible, assuring her that nothing would happen, that they had everything they needed right here. The irony wasn't lost on him. When the fever came, no distance would have been short enough. The doctor had done his best, riding through a blizzard to reach them. But Martha and Emma were gone within days of each other, leaving Samuel in a house that suddenly felt large as a cathedral and twice as cold. That was 3 winters ago. 3 winters of hired help who couldn't stand the silence, of conversations with horses who at least didn't expect answers, of books read by lamplight and meals eaten alone. The ranch thrived under his careful management. Cattle prices were up. The horses he bred were sought after across the territory, but success had a bitter taste when there was no one to share it with. Samuel undressed in the dark, hanging his clothes on the same hooks, folding them the same way he had for years. Routine was all he had left. Routine and the endless cycle of seasons that marked time's passage without meaning. Tomorrow he would post the letter, hire another cook who would leave come spring, and continue the careful performance of living that fooled everyone but himself. As he lay in the darkness, listening to the wind sing its lonely song through the eaves, Samuel Hartley closed his eyes and tried not to dream, but dreams came anyway, filled with voices he'd never hear again and a warmth that no fire could replace. In the morning, he would rise, tend his empire, and face another day. It was enough. It had to be. The storm broke just before dawn, covering the world in a blanket of white that made everything clean and new. Samuel stood at his window again, watching the sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold. Somewhere out there, life went on. People laughed, loved, lived. But here in his fortress of solitude, the millionaire rancher prepared for another winter of simply enduring, unaware that fate had already set in motion events that would shatter his carefully constructed isolation and teach him that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as the things we fear most. The wagon appeared on the horizon just as Samuel was finishing his morning coffee, a dark speck against the endless white that gradually took shape as it struggled through the fresh snow. He frowned, setting down his cup. Jake had gone to town 2 days ago to post the letter and wasn't due back until tomorrow. No one else had business at the Hartley Ranch in the dead of winter. Through the kitchen window, he watched the wagon's laborious progress up the long drive. The horses' tired nags from town's livery, by the look of them strained against the weight of snow and mud. As it drew closer, Samuel could make out a lone figure hunched on the driver's seat, wrapped in what appeared to be every piece of clothing they owned. Not a man. The realization hit him as the wagon pulled into the yard. The figure's movements as they climbed down were unmistakably feminine, despite the bulky layers. Samuel's frown deepened. The agency couldn't have responded this quickly. And besides, he'd specifically requested no women. They were nothing but trouble on a ranch full of men, stirring up problems he had no patience to handle. He was already composing his dismissal when she turned to face the house, and the words died in his throat. She was young, maybe 25, with a face that might have been pretty if it weren't so gaunt with exhaustion. Dark hair escaped from beneath a worn bonnet, and her dress, visible beneath the inadequate coat, had seen better days. But it was her eyes that stopped him, gray as winter steel and just as hard, with a determination that reminded him of horses he'd broken who'd rather die than submit. She didn't knock, just stood there in his yard, chin raised despite the wind that cut through her thin clothes like knives. Samuel found himself pulling on his coat and boots, drawn outside by a combination of irritation and curiosity. "You're lost," he said without preamble as he stepped onto the porch. "Town's back the way you came. 30 miles. "I'm not lost." Her voice carried a slight southern accent, softened by exhaustion but not weakened by it. "You're Samuel Hartley." "I am, and you're on private property." She reached into her coat and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper. His advertisement, torn from the territorial newspaper. "You need a cook." "I need a cook," he agreed. "A man. Says so right in the notice." "No, it doesn't." She thrust the paper at him. "Says experienced, quiet, and willing to live remote. That's me." Samuel didn't take the paper. He was too busy noticing what her movement had revealed, the unmistakable swell of pregnancy beneath her dress. 6 months along, maybe 7. His jaw tightened. "You're with child." "Nothing wrong with your eyes." The words might have been flippant, but her tone was flat, matter of fact. "Doesn't affect my cooking." Maybe not, but he gestured vaguely at her condition, at the wagon, at the sheer impossibility of her presence here. "You can't stay here. It wouldn't be proper." Something flickered across her face, not disappointment, but a kind of grim recognition, as if she'd expected nothing else. "Proper," she repeated, and now there was a bitter edge to her voice. "Well, Mr. Hartley, I left proper behind in Kansas, along with everything else. I can cook, clean, and keep my mouth shut. That's what you advertised for. Nothing in there about being proper." "Where's your husband?" The question hung between them in the cold air. She met his gaze steadily, but he saw her hands tighten on the advertisement. "Dead. Cave-in at the Copper Creek mine. 2 months back." Samuel felt something twist in his chest, sympathy, perhaps, or recognition of a grief that mirrored his own. He pushed it down. "I'm sorry for your loss, but this isn't a charity house. You'd be the only woman on a ranch with 8 men, in your condition." "In my condition, I need work," she cut him off, steel creeping back into her voice. "I've tried every respectable establishment from here to Cheyenne. Turns out nobody wants to hire a widow carrying another man's baby. You were my last stop before." She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Samuel knew what happened to women with no money and no options, especially those with children to feed. The thought made him uncomfortable in ways he didn't want to examine. "What's your name?" "Elizabeth Collins." She paused, then added with a touch of defiance, "Beth." "Well, Mrs. Collins." "Just Beth." The interruption was quiet but firm. "Mrs. Collins died with her husband." They stood there in the snow, taking each other's measure. Samuel saw a woman pushed to her limits but not broken, desperate but not begging. She saw, he didn't know what she saw, a cold man, probably, a selfish one, someone who'd send a pregnant widow back into the winter because it was inconvenient to do otherwise. "I can't pay you until spring," he heard himself saying. "Room and board only until the cattle drive. The men eat in the bunkhouse. You'd cook there but sleep in the house. There's a room off the kitchen." He paused, already regretting the words. "It's hard work. Harder in your condition. I've done hard work all my life." She wasn't smiling. He had the feeling she didn't smile much anymore, but something in her face softened fractionally. "Room and board is all I need." Samuel looked past her to the wagon. No bags, no trunks. Just a single carpet bag so small it was almost pitiful. This woman had literally nothing but the clothes on her back and the child in her belly. The part of him that had died with Martha and Emma stirred uneasily. "The driver's waiting to be paid," she said, misinterpreting his gaze. I used the last of my money to get here. Of course she had. Samuel reached into his pocket, pulled out more bills than the fare could possibly be, and strode past her to the wagon. The driver, a grizzled old-timer he recognized from town, took the money with a knowing look. Figured you'd keep her on, the driver said quietly. She's had a rough go of it. Husband was a good man. What I heard, shame about the mine. Samuel didn't respond, just waited until the wagon turned and headed back down the drive. When he faced Beth again, she was still standing where he'd left her, that carpet bag now at her feet. She hadn't presumed to enter the house, hadn't moved toward the door, just waited, patient as stone. "Come on, then," he said gruffly. "I'll show you the kitchen." She picked up her bag and followed him, her steps careful on the icy boards of the porch. Inside. She stopped just past the threshold, eyes taking in the large main room with its expensive furnishings and layer of dust. Samuel saw it through her eyes suddenly, the neglect beneath the wealth, the loneliness that no amount of money could hide. "Kitchen's through here," he said, leading her past the cold parlor and empty dining room. The kitchen, at least, was functional, a massive cast-iron stove, shelves stocked with supplies, a pump that brought water right indoors, luxuries most frontier homes couldn't dream of. "Lord have mercy," Beth whispered, the first genuine emotion he'd heard from her. She moved to the stove like a woman in a trance, running her hands over the cooking surface, checking the dampers and flues with practiced efficiency. This is a beautiful stove." "It works well enough. Gets hot in summer." Samuel felt oddly embarrassed by her reverence. "Your room's there." He indicated a door beside the pantry. "It's not much." Beth opened the door to reveal a small but clean room with a narrow bed, washstand, and hooks for clothes. A single window looked out toward the mountains. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, one hand pressed to her belly. "It's perfect," she said softly, and Samuel had the uncomfortable feeling she might cry. But when she turned back to him, her eyes were dry. "What time do the men eat?" 5 in the morning, noon, 6 at night. There's 8 hands, including Jake, my foreman. They're good men, but—" He paused, searching for words. "Keep your distance. It's better that way." "I'm not looking for friends. Mr. Hartley, just work." "Good." He turned to leave, then remembered. "There's a bell by the back door. Ring it when meals are ready. The men know to come." "And you?" The question caught him off guard. "What about me?" "Where do you take your meals?" "Here, usually." He gestured vaguely at the kitchen table. I'll manage." Something flickered across her face, amusement, perhaps, or pity. "I'll set your place with the others," she said. "Man who works should eat proper." Samuel opened his mouth to argue, to establish the boundaries that would keep this arrangement from becoming complicated. But faced with that steady gray gaze, he found himself merely nodding. "Suit yourself." He left her there, exploring her new domain with the intense focus of a woman who'd found unexpected salvation. As he headed back to his study, Samuel tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing. Come spring, she'd move on, find something better. He'd hire the male cook he'd wanted in the first place. Everything would go back to normal. But as he heard pots clanging in the kitchen, the first sounds of domestic life in 3 years, Samuel Hartley had the unsettling feeling that normal was already a thing of the past. The first week passed in careful silence. Beth rose at 4 each morning, the kitchen windows still dark as pitch, and by the time Samuel came down, coffee was brewing and biscuits were already browning in the oven. She moved through the space like a ghost, efficient and nearly soundless, acknowledging his presence with nothing more than a nod. The men had been skeptical at first. Samuel had seen it in their faces when he'd introduced her that first morning, the surprise, the concern, the careful way they'd avoided looking at her belly. But hunger was a powerful advocate, and after that first breakfast of fluffy biscuits, thick gravy, crispy bacon, and eggs that weren't burned to leather. Any objections had disappeared into appreciative silence. Samuel took his meals at the kitchen table as she'd suggested, but they ate without speaking. She served him the same as the others, filled his coffee cup when it emptied, cleared his plate when he finished. Their only communication was the soft "thank you" he'd mutter and her quiet "you're welcome" in response. It should have been comfortable. This silence, it was what he'd wanted. Instead, it felt like holding his breath underwater, sustainable for a while, but not forever. He found himself watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, the way she moved despite her growing belly, adapting her movements with unconscious grace, the way she kneaded bread dough, her thin arms stronger than they looked, the way she sometimes paused at the window, staring out at the mountains with an expression he couldn't read. At night, he could hear her through the walls. Not crying, she never cried. At least not where he could hear, but moving restlessly, the narrow bed creaking as she tried to find a comfortable position. Sometimes he heard her walking, slow footsteps pacing the small room. Once, very late, he thought he heard her singing, so soft it might have been the wind. The second week brought the first real storm of winter. It rolled down from the mountains like an avalanche of white, burying the ranch under 3 feet of snow in as many days. The men struggled to keep the pathways clear, to get feed to the cattle, to maintain the lifeline between buildings. Beth never complained, though Samuel knew the kitchen must be freezing in the pre-dawn hours, the stove cold and waiting. On the worst night, when the wind howled like demons and the house groaned under the assault, Samuel found himself unable to sleep. He lay in his bed, listening to the storm, when he heard a crash from below. Without thinking, he grabbed his robe and hurried downstairs. Beth stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the shattered remains of a mixing bowl, flour dusting her nightgown and bare feet. She was utterly still, staring at the mess as if she couldn't quite comprehend how it had happened. "I'm sorry," she said without looking up. "I couldn't sleep. Thought I'd get a start on tomorrow's bread. I'll clean it up." "You're barefoot," Samuel said, the words rough with sleep. "Don't move. You'll cut yourself." He fetched the broom and dustpan, worked around her carefully, sweeping up ceramic shards and flour in equal measure. She stood there the whole time, arms wrapped around her belly, looking lost in a way that made something twist in his chest. "Sit," he ordered when he'd cleared a path. She sank into a kitchen chair, and he noticed her feet were blue with cold. Without thinking, he knelt and examined them for cuts, his hands gentle despite their calluses. "My feet are fine," she said softly. "They're frozen." He stood abruptly, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment. "I'll stoke the fire." As he worked on the stove, building the flames higher, Beth spoke again. "I dream about the cave-in sometimes. They wouldn't let me see him after. Said it was better that way. But sometimes I wonder. Sometimes I think maybe it wasn't him. Maybe he's still down there, trying to dig his way out, wondering why I left." Samuel's hand stilled on the stove poker. He knew about those kinds of dreams, the ones where the dead weren't dead, where you could save them if you just tried harder, moved faster, made different choices. "How far along are you?" he asked, instead of addressing her words. 7 months, near as I can figure." She placed a protective hand over her belly. "Thomas never knew. I was going to tell him that night, after his shift. Had a special dinner planned and everything." The fire crackled, warmth beginning to spread through the kitchen. Samuel poured coffee from the pot that always seemed to be warm on the back of the stove, set a cup in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it gratefully. "Do you have people somewhere, family?" A bitter smile touched her lips. Thomas's family made it clear they wanted nothing to do with his half-breed wife or her baby. "My people? Well, they're gone. Have been for a long time." Samuel studied her face in the firelight, seeing for the first time the features he'd missed before: the high cheekbones, the particular cast to her eyes that spoke of mixed heritage. It explained the steel in her spine, Perhaps life was harder for those caught between worlds. That why you came all the way out here? Partially. She took a sip of coffee. Also because you were the only one advertising for a cook who didn't include "No Indians Need Apply" in the notice. They sat in silence after that, drinking coffee while the storm raged outside. Samuel found himself thinking of Martha, how she'd feared storms in their early years here. He'd held her through them, promising protection from wind and weather alike. Empty promises. As it turned out, wind and weather weren't what killed her. "I should go back to bed," Beth said eventually. "Morning comes early." "Take the lamp," Samuel said. And he paused, then went to the pantry, returning with a pair of thick wool socks. "These'll help with the cold." She took them with visible surprise. "Thank you," after she'd gone. Samuel remained in the kitchen, staring into the fire. The storm was beginning to break, the wind's howl fading to a whisper. Come morning, the world would be buried in white, transformed into something clean and new. But underneath, everything would be the same. The frozen earth, the dormant grass, the roots waiting for spring. The days that followed fell back into routine, but something had shifted. Their silences felt different now. Less like walls and more like understanding, perhaps. Samuel found himself lingering over his coffee in the mornings, watching her work. She never acknowledged these extended meals, but sometimes he caught the ghost of a smile when he complimented the food. The men noticed too. Jake mentioned it one afternoon as they repaired a fence damaged by the storm. "She's good for the place," he said carefully. "Men are eating better, working harder. Even old Pete stopped complaining about his rheumatism." "She's temporary," Samuel reminded him. "Come spring, she'll move on." Jake gave him a look Samuel chose to ignore. "If you say so, boss. Just seems a shame to lose a cook that good, especially one who don't cause no trouble." That was the thing. Though, Beth didn't cause trouble in any of the ways Samuel had feared. She kept to herself, never flirted with the hands, never complained about the work or the isolation. But her very presence was a disruption, a stone thrown into the still pond of his existence. Ripples spread in directions he couldn't predict or control. Like the way he'd started noticing when she was tired, the slight droop to her shoulders that meant her back was aching, or how he'd found himself chopping extra wood, stacking it close to the kitchen door so she wouldn't have to venture into the cold. Small things, dangerous things. One evening, coming in later than usual from tending a sick horse, Samuel found the kitchen empty but his dinner waiting, covered and warm on the back of the stove. Beside the plate was a slice of dried apple pie, the kind Martha used to make. He stood there for a long moment, staring at that pie, feeling something crack inside his chest like river ice in spring. When Beth emerged from her room to bank the stove for the night, she found him still standing there. "Is something wrong with the food?" she asked, concern creasing her brow. "No," he managed. Where did you learn to make pie like this?" "My grandmother, she said the secret was in how you dried the apples, and a touch of cinnamon." She studied his face. "I can make something else if you prefer." "No." The word came out too sharp. He softened it. "No, it's fine. Good, thank you." She nodded and went about her nightly routine, checking the stove, the windows, the door. Samuel ate mechanically, tasting memories with every bite. When he finished, he set the dishes in the sink as always. But this time, instead of retreating immediately to his study, he paused. "Beth." She turned, surprised. It was the first time he'd used her name voluntarily. "The pie was... Martha used to make it the same way." Understanding dawned in her gray eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to..." "It's all right." And strangely, it was. Just caught me off guard. They stood there in the warm kitchen, two people marked by loss, not speaking because sometimes words were unnecessary. Outside, the wind whispered secrets to the snow, and the ranch settled into another long winter night. But inside, for just a moment, the silence felt less like emptiness and more like the space between heartbeats necessary, natural, and surprisingly alive. The night it happened, snow was falling soft as feathers, muffling the world in white silence. Samuel had retired to his study after dinner. Ledgers spread before him, but the numbers swam meaninglessly on the page. From the kitchen came the quiet sounds of Beth cleaning up the splash of water, the soft clink of dishes, the scrape of a chair being pushed under the table. Then, a sharp gasp followed by the crash of breaking china. He was on his feet before the sound fully registered, crossing through the house in quick strides. He found Beth gripping the edge of the sink, her knuckles white, face twisted in pain. The remains of a teacup lay scattered on the floor. "What is it?" He moved toward her instinctively. "The baby." She shook her head tightly. Just a pain. They come sometimes. It'll pass." But even as she spoke, another wave hit her. This time she couldn't suppress the small cry that escaped. Samuel had seen enough animals birth to recognize real labor when he saw it. And this wasn't it, but something was wrong. "Sit," he commanded, guiding her to a chair. "When did this start?" "This morning," she admitted reluctantly. "But it wasn't bad then, just twinges." "You worked all day through this." Exasperation and something else concerned colored his voice. "I've had worse." But her face was pale, beads of sweat forming despite the kitchen's warmth. Samuel made a decision. "You're done for the night. Can you make it to your room?" "The dishes will keep until morning." He helped her stand, surprised by how light she felt despite her condition. "Lean on me." For once, she didn't argue. They made their slow way to her small room, Beth pausing twice as pains gripped her, once settled on her bed. She looked up at him with those steady gray eyes. "I'll be fine. Just need to rest." Samuel wasn't convinced, but short of riding to town for the doctor impossible in this weather, there was little he could do. "I'll check on you later," he said gruffly. Back in his study, he tried to focus on the ledgers, but found himself listening for any sound from below. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house, and with it came memories of another night, another woman in pain, another time when he'd been powerless to help. Near midnight, unable to stand it anymore, he made his way downstairs. A faint light showed under Beth's door. He knocked softly. "Come in." She was sitting up in bed, fully dressed, arms wrapped around her belly. In the lamplight, he could see she'd been crying, though her face was dry now. "Can't sleep," she said unnecessarily. Samuel pulled the room's single chair closer to the bed. "Tell me about Thomas." The request surprised them both. Beth looked at him for a long moment. Then something in her face softened. "He was a good man," she began slowly. "Quiet, like you. But he had this laugh. When something really tickled him, he'd throw his head back and laugh like a boy. Used to embarrass him something terrible in public." "How did you meet?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "At a church social in Topeka. I was serving pineapple. As it happens, he came back for 3 slices just to have an excuse to talk to me. Later told me he didn't even like apple pie. But he liked you. Eventually, took him 6 months to work up the courage to court me proper. My grandmother thought he was too shy. Said I needed a man with more spine. But I knew." She trailed off, one hand moving in slow circles over her belly. "I knew he was the one when he stood up to a group of cowboys hassling an old Indian man in town. Didn't make a big fuss. Just stepped in quiet-like and stood there until they backed down. That's when I knew he had spine enough." Samuel found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story. "Your grandmother raised you." "After my parents died, yes, she was Lakota. Married a white trader young and lived to regret it. But she stayed because of my mother, and then because of me." Beth's voice carried old pain, old pride. "She taught me to cook, to survive, to never let anyone see me bend. Stand straight, she used to say, even when you're breaking inside. Stand straight. She sounds formidable. Thomas was terrified of her. That ghost smile again. But she liked him in the end. Said any man who could stay quiet that long must have something worthwhile to say when he finally spoke. Silence fell between them. But it wasn't the careful silence of their early days. This was something warmer, shaped by shared words and mutual understanding. Samuel found himself speaking before he'd decided to. Martha was nothing like that. She was sunshine, I suppose. Always laughing, always moving. Couldn't sit still for more than 5 minutes unless she had sewing in her hands. Used to drive me half mad sometimes. All that energy. How long were you married? 8 years. Emma came along in the 2nd year, red hair like her mother, but my stubborn streak. The words hurt, but it was a cleaner pain than the festering silence he'd wrapped around their memory. She'd be 7 now. Would have been. I'm sorry. Scarlet fever took them both. Doctor said it happens sometimes. Sweeps through a family like wildfire. I was away, checking on the herds. By the time Jake found me, brought me back, he stopped, jaw tight. 3 days. That's all it took. 3 days and my whole world was gone. Beth's hand moved across the space between them, not quite touching his where it rested on his knee, but close. Thomas had been working extra shifts, saving for the baby, he said. Wanted to have enough put by so I could rest after the birth. The cave-in happened on his last scheduled double. If he'd just worked regular hours. You can't think that way. Can't I? Her eyes met his, bright with unshed tears. Don't you all the ifs and should-haves and if-onlys? Every day, Samuel admitted. Every damn day. They sat with that truth between them. 2 people who understood the weight of surviving when others hadn't. Outside, the storm was building, but inside the small room, something else was building to a bridge across grief, perhaps, or at least the recognition that neither of them grieved alone. The pains have stopped, Beth said eventually. I think it was just the baby settling. Sometimes that happens. You should still rest. Take tomorrow off. And feed 8 hungry men what exactly? I can manage. No. The word was firm. I need to work. It's what keeps me steady. When I'm kneading bread or stirring soup, I just am. Can you understand that? Samuel thought of his own ledgers, the endless checking of figures, the way numbers could crowd out memories if he concentrated hard enough. Yes, he stood to go, but Beth's voice stopped him at the door. Thank you for listening, she gestured helplessly. Just thank you. Get some sleep, he said gruffly, uncomfortable with gratitude. And if the pains come back, I'll wake you, she promised. Back in his own bed, Samuel stared at the ceiling and thought about stories shared in lamplight, about grief given voice, about the dangerous comfort of being understood. He'd built his walls so carefully these past 3 years, brick by brick, silence by silence. But tonight, with a few quiet words, a pregnant widow had found the first crack. He thought of Thomas, working double shifts for a child he'd never meet, of Martha, laughing as she chased Emma through summer grass, of Beth's grandmother, teaching a mixed-blood girl to stand straight even when breaking, of all the love that persisted past death, all the connections that endured beyond loss. For the first time in 3 years, when sleep finally took him, Samuel Hartley didn't dream of what he'd lost. Instead, he dreamed of kitchens warm with bread scent and conversation, of stories told while snow fell silent outside, of the peculiar grace that sometimes arose from sharing the weight of sorrow with someone who understood its true measure. In the morning, he woke to the smell of coffee and biscuits, the sound of Beth moving carefully but determinedly through her morning routine. He dressed and went down to find her working as always, though he noticed she'd pulled a stool near the stove to sit while she cooked. "Stubborn woman," he muttered, but there was no heat in it. She glanced at him, and, for just a moment, something like warmth flickered in her gray eyes. "Takes one to know one, Mr. Hartley." And despite himself, despite all his carefully maintained defenses, Samuel felt the corner of his mouth twitch in what might almost have been a smile. Samuel first noticed the change in himself when he caught Jake grinning at him over breakfast. He'd been watching Beth work at the stove, noting how she'd shifted her weight to ease the strain on her back, and without thinking had risen to fetch the heavy skillet she was reaching for. "I can manage," she'd said, but he'd already taken it from the warming shelf, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "No need to strain yourself," he'd muttered, returning to his seat under Jake's knowing look. That was the beginning. Small gestures that seemed to happen without his conscious decision. A new cushion appeared on her kitchen stool. The wood box never emptied, no matter how cold the nights grew. When she mentioned in passing that peppermint tea helped with the baby's restlessness, a tin of it materialized in the pantry. Beth never commented on these things directly, but Samuel noticed her fingers sometimes lingered on the gifts, a puzzled softness crossing her face. 2 weeks before Christmas, he found her in the barn, of all places, trying to reach something on a high shelf. The sight of her balanced precariously on an overturned bucket, belly extended, nearly stopped his heart. "What in blazes are you doing?" The words came out harsher than intended, driven by fear. She startled but didn't fall. Thank God. "I needed burlap. For pudding bags." "And you couldn't ask someone?" He lifted her down, hands firm around her waist, setting her on solid ground before stepping back quickly. "Jake, me, any of the hands." "Everyone's busy. I didn't want to be a bother." "A bother?" Samuel stared at her. "Woman, you falling and hurting yourself or the baby would be considerably more bother than fetching some damn burlap." Her chin lifted in that way he'd come to recognize. "I've been taking care of myself a long time, Mr. Hartley." "Well, you don't have to now," he snapped, then immediately wanted to call the words back. They revealed too much, promised too much. They stood there in the dusty barn, afternoon light slanting through the gaps in the boards, painting golden stripes across the hay-strewn floor. Beth's hand rested on her belly, and Samuel could see the baby move beneath her dress, a rolling motion like waves under canvas. "It's Christmas pudding," she said finally, quietly. "My grandmother's recipe. I thought, the men work so hard, and they're so far from their families. I wanted to make something special." The fight went out of him. "How much burlap do you need?" He fetched it for her, along with anything else she pointed out, carrying the supplies back to the kitchen. As she sorted through the items, he found himself hovering, unwilling to return to his ledgers just yet. "Do you need help?" The question surprised them both. Beth looked at him, flour already dusting her hands. "Can you chop?" That's how Jake found them an hour later, Samuel in his shirt sleeves, carefully dicing dried fruit while Beth mixed batter, the kitchen warm with steam and cinnamon scent. His foreman took in the domestic scene with raised eyebrows, but wisely said nothing beyond asking about the next day's work assignments. After Jake left, Beth glanced at Samuel. "He thinks something's between us." "Jake thinks too much," Samuel said, concentrating on the raisins. "The other men probably think it too." She shaped the pudding with practiced hands. "A widow, living in your house." "Let them think what they want. We know the truth." "Do we?" The question was soft, almost lost in the sound of spoons against bowls. Samuel's hands stilled. He could feel her watching him. Waiting. The safe answer was easy, yes. Of course they knew the truth. She was his cook. He was her employer. And come spring, this arrangement would end. But standing there in the kitchen, they'd somehow made theirs, watching her create Christmas for men who weren't her family out of nothing but kindness and flour. Samuel found he couldn't voice that lie. "You should rest," he said instead. "You've been on your feet too long." She didn't push, just nodded and returned to her puddings. But the question hung in the air between them, unanswered and increasingly unanswerable. That night, Samuel couldn't concentrate on his books. He pulled out paper and began making lists instead. Things the baby would need, things Beth would need, the practicalities of birth in winter, miles from town. He'd helped deliver enough calves and foals to know the basics, but a human baby. He found himself in the back bedroom, the one that had been Emma's nursery. He'd locked it the day after the funeral, but the key turned easily despite 3 years of neglect. Everything was as Martha had left it, the crib he'd built himself, the rocking chair where she'd sung lullabies, the tiny clothes folded with heartbreaking neatness in the drawers. Dust motes danced in the moonlight as Samuel moved through the room, touching things he'd thought never to handle again. The crib was solid still, just needed cleaning. The rocking chair creaked but held his weight. The clothes! He lifted a small gown, white cotton soft as clouds, embroidered with yellow flowers by Martha's patient hands. For a moment, grief threatened to swallow him whole. Then he thought of Beth, making Christmas puddings for lonely cowboys, standing straight even when breaking inside. Carefully, he began sorting what might be useful. The next morning, he found Jake and gave him a list. "Need you to pick these up in town. Don't mention it to Beth." Jake scanned the items: clean cloths, carbolic, various medicines. His expression grew grave. "You thinking what I'm thinking about the baby coming? Winter's no time to be unprepared. Doc Morrison's good, but if a storm hits..." "I know." Samuel had been thinking of little else. "Just get what's on the list, and..." He hesitated, then added, "Stop by Granger's. See if his wife still has that birthing book she mentioned when Emma was born." Jake nodded. "Might be other things needed. Women's things. Should I ask Mrs. Granger?" "Use your judgment." Samuel turned to go, then looked back. "And Jake, keep it quiet." But secrets were hard to keep on a ranch. By evening, Samuel could tell the men knew something was afoot. They were extra gentle with Beth, jumping to carry things before she could reach for them, finding excuses to check if she needed anything. Old Pete even removed his hat indoors, a courtesy he'd never shown before. Beth noticed, of course. Samuel saw her puzzlement give way to understanding. Then something softer as she watched the rough cowboys treat her like spun glass. After dinner, she stopped him as he headed for his study. "The men seem to think I might break." "The men worry," Samuel said carefully. "And you," she looked up at him, those gray eyes seeing too much. "Do you worry?" He thought of the locked nursery, now cleaned and waiting, of the supplies Jake would bring from town, of all the things that could go wrong when a baby came too early or too hard or too fast. "Yes," he admitted. She was quiet for a moment, one hand absently rubbing her belly. "I'm scared too," she whispered. "Not of the pain, but what if I'm not enough? What if I can't take care of this baby alone?" Without thinking, Samuel reached out, covering her restless hand with his own. "You won't be alone." The words hung between them, heavy with promise. Beth's fingers turned under his, interlacing briefly before he pulled away, burned by the contact and what it implied. "I should." He gestured vaguely toward his study. "Yes," but she smiled, a real smile that transformed her tired face. "Thank you, Samuel." It was the first time she'd used his given name. He carried the sound of it with him to his study, where he sat staring at ledgers without seeing them, thinking about promises made in warm kitchens and hands that fit together too easily. Outside, snow began to fall again, heavy and thick. By morning, the world would be transformed once more, wrapped in winter's white silence. But inside the ranch house, something else was transforming two broken people slowly, carefully, beginning to imagine a future that contained more than just survival. Samuel looked up from his meaningless numbers to find he'd been sketching on the ledger's margin. A crib, a rocking chair, a woman's hand holding a baby. a man's larger hand covering both. He stared at the drawing, then deliberately tore out the page and fed it to the fire. Some hopes were too dangerous to put on paper, too fragile to survive examination. But as he watched the flames consume his unconscious wishes, Samuel Hartley allowed himself one moment of raw honesty he didn't want Beth to leave come spring. The admission terrified him more than any blizzard, any stampede, any physical danger he'd ever faced, because wanting meant the possibility of losing again, and he wasn't sure he could survive that twice. From the kitchen came the sound of Beth singing softly, some lullaby in a language he didn't recognize. Samuel closed his eyes and listened, letting the melody wash over him like a promise of things he dared not name. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges: Jake's return from town, the approaching birth, the weight of decisions yet unmade. But tonight, with snow falling and puddings cooling and a woman's voice carrying hope through the darkness, Samuel Hartley let himself feel something he'd thought gone forever, the stirring of a future that might, against all odds, hold joy. The storm struck on the second day of January, rolling down from the mountains with a fury that seemed personal. Samuel had seen the signs: the restless cattle, the way the horses bunched together, the peculiar heaviness in the air, but nothing could have prepared them for the violence of its arrival. He was in the barn when Beth's scream cut through the howling wind. Samuel ran, fighting through snow that was already knee-deep, the 100 yards to the house feeling like miles. He burst through the kitchen door to find Beth gripping the table, her face contorted in pain, water pooling at her feet. "It's time," she gasped. "The baby! It's coming now!" Too early. The calculation flashed through his mind. She wasn't due for another 3 weeks. But babies kept their own schedules, and this one had chosen the worst possible moment. "Can you make it to your room?" She nodded, but when she tried to walk, another contraction seized her. Samuel caught her before she fell, lifting her into his arms without hesitation. She was heavier than he'd expected, but fear gave him strength. He carried her to the room he'd secretly prepared, not her small chamber off the kitchen, but the nursery upstairs. Beth's eyes widened when she saw it: the clean bed with fresh linens, the water already heating on the small stove he'd installed, the supplies laid out with military precision. "When did you—" "Hush," he said, settling her on the bed. "Save your strength." The storm shook the house, wind screaming through every gap and joint. Samuel had delivered calves in blizzards, foals in freezing rain. But this was different. This was Beth, and the child she carried, and his hands shook as he helped her out of her wet dress. "The book," he muttered, reaching for the birthing guide Jake had brought from town. "There's supposed to be stages." "Samuel," Beth's hand caught his, surprisingly strong. "Look at me." He met her gray eyes, saw pain there, but also determination. "I need you to listen," she said between gasps. "My grandmother delivered dozens of babies. She taught me, but I can't do this alone." "Tell me what you need." For the next hour, she guided him through the preparations, her voice steady even as contractions racked her body. Water boiled, cloths were readied, the bed was arranged. Samuel found himself falling into a rhythm, following her instructions with the same focus he brought to breaking horses or balancing ledgers. Then the real labor began. Beth tried to muffle her cries at first, biting down on a rolled cloth. But as the pains intensified, she gave up all pretense of stoicism. Samuel knelt beside the bed, letting her crush his hands during contractions, murmuring encouragement he wasn't sure she could hear over the storm's rage. "Something's wrong," she panted between contractions. "It's too hard, too long." Samuel checked, trying to remember everything the book had said, everything he'd learned from years of animal births. The baby was turned wrong, coming shoulder first instead of head first. His heart sank. "The baby's breech," he said quietly. Beth's eyes filled with tears, the first he'd seen from her. Do you know how to—" "I've done it with calves." The admission sounded absurd even to his ears. The principle's the same. Then do it. Her jaw set with that familiar stubbornness. I trust you. Those 3 words gave him courage he didn't feel. With infinite care, between contractions, Samuel did what he'd done dozens of times in barns and fields. Only this time, instead of a calf's life in his hands, it was a child. Beth's child. The child he'd unconsciously come to think of as theirs. The storm reached its crescendo as the baby finally turned. Beth screamed, a sound that tore through Samuel like lightning. Then, with a final push that seemed to take everything she had, the baby slid into his waiting hands. Too small, too still, too blue. Why isn't she crying? Beth struggled to sit up. Samuel, why? He was already working, clearing the tiny mouth and nose, rubbing the small chest, breathing his own air into lungs no bigger than walnuts. The book had been specific about this. Sometimes babies needed help to start breathing. Nothing. Please, Beth whispered, reaching for her child. Please. Samuel kept working, refusing to give up. He'd lost too much already. Not this, not now. He breathed again into the tiny mouth, rubbed the small back more vigorously. And then a cough, a sputter, a thin, reedy wail that was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. There we go, he said, his voice rough. There's a fighter. He cleaned the baby quickly, efficiently, marveling at the tiny fingers, the shock of dark hair. A girl, perfect despite her early arrival. When he placed her in Beth's arms, both women were crying. She's beautiful, Beth whispered, touching the small face with wonder. So small, but beautiful. Samuel busied himself with the aftermath of birth, giving them privacy for this first meeting. But when he turned back, Beth was holding the baby out to him. You saved her, she said simply. You should hold her. The weight of the child in his arms was nothing. The weight of the moment was everything. Samuel looked down at the tiny face, the eyes that couldn't yet focus but seemed to see him anyway, and felt something inside him crack open like ice in spring. What will you name her? Beth was quiet for a long moment. Hope, she said finally. Hope Martha Hartley. Samuel's head snapped up. Beth! If you'll have us, she continued, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. I know what I am, a widow with nothing but the clothes on my back. I know what you are, a man who's built walls so high you can barely see over them anymore. But Samuel. She reached out, touching his hand where it cradled the baby. We're already a family, aren't we, in all the ways that matter? The storm still raged outside, but in the warm nursery, Samuel felt a different kind of storm, one that swept away 3 years of carefully maintained isolation. He looked at Beth, pale and exhausted, but fierce with new motherhood. At the baby who'd fought her way into the world with his help. At the room he'd prepared without admitting why. The men will talk, he said, his last weak defense. Let them. Beth's smile was tired but real. I've been ruined since the day Thomas died. You can't ruin me worse. You're not ruined. The words came out fierce. You're the strongest woman I've known. Then marry me, she said simply. Not for propriety or charity, but because you held my hand through the worst pain of my life. Because you breathed life into our daughter when she couldn't find it herself. Because you make me want to hope again, even when hope seems foolish. Our daughter. The words echoed in the room like a promise. Samuel looked down at the baby again, hope, their hope, and made his decision. When the storm breaks, I'll send Jake for the preacher. Is that a yes? Instead of answering with words, Samuel leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle, careful of her exhaustion and his own fragility, but it sealed something between them more surely than any vows could. Hope stirred in his arms, making small sounds of protest. Beth laughed softly, taking the baby to nurse. Samuel sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Beth's shoulders. watching their daughter feed with a wonder he'd thought lost forever. The storm continued through the night, but inside the nursery, a different kind of weather prevailed. The warmth of new life, new love, new possibilities. Samuel stayed awake, keeping watch over his unexpected family, feeding the stove, bringing Beth water and food, changing tiny diapers with hands that had known only rough work. As dawn broke, the storm finally exhausted itself. Weak sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating a world transformed by snow. But the greater transformation was inside, in a nursery that was no longer a shrine to loss, but a cradle for new life. In a man who'd learned that sometimes the best things came when you stopped protecting yourself from pain. In a woman who'd traveled through grief to find unexpected joy. "She's perfect," Beth murmured, half asleep, the baby peaceful at her breast. "You both are," Samuel replied, and meant it. Outside, he could hear the men stirring, beginning the hard work of digging out from the storm. Soon, Jake would make it to the house, would see the light in the nursery window and know. The news would spread the hermit rancher had taken a wife, had welcomed a child. Let them talk. Samuel had more important things to worry about now, like learning to be a father again, like remembering how to be a husband, like building a life that had room for hope as well as sorrow, for future as well as past. The baby Hope opened her eyes, seeming to look directly at him. Samuel touched her tiny fist, and she gripped his finger with surprising strength. In that moment, he understood what Beth had been trying to show him all along, that life wasn't just about surviving the winters, but about having something worth surviving for. "Welcome to the world, little one," he whispered. "Welcome home." Spring came late that year, creeping down from the mountains in fits and starts, bringing mud and meltwater and the first green shoots of hope. The ranch emerged from winter's grip slowly, like a bear from hibernation, stretching and testing muscles too long dormant. Samuel stood on the porch, Hope balanced on his hip, watching riders approach from town. 3 months old now. She gurgled contentedly, one tiny fist wrapped around his finger. Behind them, through the open door, came the sounds of Beth preparing lunch and humming, always humming these days, as if joy needed constant expression. But the rider's pace spoke of purpose, not social calling. Samuel recognized Judge Thornton's distinctive gray beard first, then Reverend Mills's black coat. The third man was a stranger, young and officious-looking, clutching a leather portfolio like a shield. "Beth," Samuel called quietly. "We have company." She appeared in the doorway, flour dusting her apron, took in the scene with one glance. Without a word, she lifted Hope from his arms and retreated inside. They discussed this possibility, questions about their hasty marriage, the convenience of it all. Small towns bred gossip like cattle bred flies. "Judge Thornton," Samuel greeted as the men dismounted. "Reverend, gentlemen, what brings you out this way?" The judge, an old acquaintance from Samuel's early ranching days, looked uncomfortable. "Official business, I'm afraid. This is Mr. Harwick from the Territorial Child Welfare Commission." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Child welfare." Harwick stepped forward, young face set in disapproving lines. "We've received concerning reports about irregular circumstances surrounding a child's birth and subsequent living situation." "Speak plain, man." "Very well." Harwick consulted his papers. "Is it true that Mrs. Hartley arrived at your ranch already with child? That you married her mere days after she gave birth? That there's some question about the child's parentage?" The words hung in the spring air like poison. Samuel felt rage building, the kind he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. But before he could speak, Beth emerged from the house, Hope in her arms, dignity wrapped around her like armor. "The child's parentage is no mystery. Mr. Harwick," she said coolly. "My late husband, Thomas Collins, died in the Copper Creek cave-in last August. The documentation is filed in Topeka, if you care to verify." Yet you married Mr. Hartley with unseemly haste. I married the man who saved both our lives, Beth interrupted. Who delivered my daughter in a blizzard when no doctor could reach us. Who showed Christian charity to a desperate widow when the rest of the world turned away. She shifted Hope to one arm, the other hand finding Samuel's. If that's unseemly, then I'll be unseemly before God and man alike. Reverend Mills cleared his throat. Sister Hartley, no one questions your circumstances, but there are proprieties to consider. The appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as... As damaging as what? Samuel's voice was dangerously quiet. As a woman and baby freezing to death, as a child growing up without a father's protection. Tell me, Reverend, which propriety should we have observed while Hope was born, blue and not breathing? The judge raised a placating hand. Samuel, no one's questioning your heroics that night, but Mr. Harwick has a point. These hasty arrangements, the lack of proper courtship period. It invites speculation. From whom? Beth demanded. Which righteous citizens have nothing better to do than count the days between my husband's death and my remarriage? Which Christian souls are so concerned with propriety that they'd see a baby torn from the only father she's known? Hope, sensing the tension, began to fuss. Samuel took her automatically, settling her against his shoulder with practiced ease. The sight of the rough rancher gentling the tiny baby made even Harwick pause. The child seems well cared for, the young official admitted reluctantly. She's loved, Samuel said simply. Fed, warm, safe, and loved. Isn't that what your commission supposedly ensures? Judge Thornton had been watching the family with shrewd eyes. Now he spoke up. Gentlemen, I've known Samuel Hartley for 15 years, knew his first wife, mourned with him when she passed. If he says this marriage is legitimate, that's good enough for me. But the timeline, Harwick protested. Young man. The judge interrupted. Have you ever delivered a baby in a blizzard? Have you ever held a woman's life in your hands while she screamed in pain? Have you ever breathed life into a child born too still? No, sir, but... Then perhaps you should reserve judgment on those who have. The judge's tone brooked no argument. I see a family here, legal, proper, and blessed by God through Reverend Mills himself. Unless you have evidence of neglect or abuse, I suggest we've wasted enough of the Hartleys' time. Harwick looked like he wanted to argue further, but Reverend Mills surprised them all by speaking up. The judge is right. I performed the ceremony myself, and while I had concerns about the haste, I've seen nothing but devotion since. The baby thrives. The household is orderly. He paused, looking at Beth with something like apology. God works in his own time, not ours. But surely an investigation is closed, Judge Thornton said firmly. Mr. Harwick, I'll be writing to your superiors about the zealous persecution of a war hero and respected rancher based on nothing more than malicious gossip. I suggest you find more worthy causes for your commission's time. The young man's face flushed red, but he subsided. As the men prepared to leave, the judge lingered. Samuel, he said quietly, I know this wasn't the family you planned, but Martha would be glad you found happiness again. Don't let small minds make you doubt what you've built here. After they'd gone, Samuel and Beth stood together on the porch, hope peaceful between them. The spring air was sweet with the promise of new grass, new calves, new life. Will they come back? Beth asked. Maybe. Probably. Samuel shifted Hope to his other arm, freeing one hand to pull Beth close. But it doesn't matter. We've faced worse than narrow-minded officials. The men who started this. Beth's voice carried an edge. It was probably the Hendersons. Wasn't it still angry about you outbidding them for the water rights last year? Let them be angry. Samuel pressed a kiss to her temple. We have what matters. That evening, Jake and the other hands made their feelings known. They'd heard about the official visit. Ranch gossip traveled faster than wildfire and had opinions to share. "Anyone else come sniffing around, causing trouble for you folks?" Old Pete declared over dinner. "They'll answer to us. Ain't right, trying to break up a family. Especially not after what you done for us." Another hand added. "Best winter we ever had, thanks to Mrs. Hartley's cooking. And little Hope here, she's like our own niece." The fierce loyalty in their rough faces made Beth's eyes mist. These men, who'd seen her at her lowest, who'd watched her story unfold, had become unlikely champions. Later that night, after Hope was sleeping and the house was quiet, Samuel found Beth standing at the nursery window, looking out at the stars. "Regrets?" he asked softly. "Never." She turned into his arms. "But I hate that Hope will grow up with whispers following her, that people will question whether this is real." "Is it?" Samuel asked. "Real?" Beth looked up at him, gray eyes serious in the lamplight. "You know it is, but we've been so careful. Samuel, going through the motions of marriage without being truly married." He understood what she wasn't quite saying. Since their wedding 3 months ago, they'd maintained separate bedrooms, careful distances, playing at propriety even in private, as if someone was watching and judging. "I didn't want to push," he said quietly. "You'd been through so much, and I wasn't sure I was ready." And now, instead of answering with words, Samuel kissed her properly for the second time in their marriage. Not the gentle brush of lips from Hope's birth night, but something deeper, hungrier. 3 months of careful restraint dissolved like spring snow. "Now," he said when they broke apart, both breathing hard, "I think we stop living for what others might think and start living for ourselves." Beth smiled, that rare, transformative expression that made her beautiful. "Then take me to bed, husband, our bed. It's time this marriage became real in every way." They moved together through the quiet house, past Hope's nursery where their daughter slept peacefully, to the master bedroom Samuel had avoided for 3 years. But it didn't feel like Martha's room anymore. It felt like theirs, a place for new memories, new love, new life. As moonlight painted silver squares on the floor and spring peepers sang outside the windows, Samuel and Beth claimed each other fully for the first time, not out of desperation or convenience, but out of love that had grown slowly through shared sorrows and quiet understanding. Afterward, as Beth slept curled against him, Samuel stared at the ceiling and marveled at the strange turns life could take. He'd thought himself dead inside, frozen solid as winter ground, but somehow, through grace or luck or divine intervention, he'd been given a second chance. Not a replacement for what he'd lost. Nothing could ever replace Martha and Emma, but something new and precious in its own right. Hope's cry broke the pre-dawn quiet. Samuel rose to tend her, bringing her to Beth for feeding. As he watched his wife nurse their daughter, he thought about the officials with their papers and proprieties, the gossips with their whispers and judgment. Let them come. He'd face them all and worse to protect this family, this unexpected blessing, this proof that sometimes love came disguised as duty and bloomed despite the roughest ground. "No more separate rooms," Beth murmured sleepily as Hope settled back to sleep. "No more walls," Samuel agreed, gathering both of them close. Outside, dawn was breaking over the ranch, painting the mountains gold and rose. A new day, a new season, a new chapter in a story that had nearly ended in sorrow, but somehow found its way to joy. And in the growing light, the Hartley ranch stood strong against whatever storms might come, sheltering the family that had formed not through careful planning, but through courage, compassion, and the wild hope that broken hearts could learn to beat again. A year later, on another spring morning, Samuel stood in the same spot on the porch where he'd once faced down officials and their papers. But this time, his arms were empty of babies, and his face wore something that his ranch hands hadn't seen in the 4 years they'd known him, a full, genuine smile. Papa, look. Hope toddled across the yard, her dark hair bouncing in the sunshine, chasing a butterfly with the determination she'd inherited from her mother. At 15 months, she was a force of nature, transforming the quiet ranch into a playground of constant discovery. Careful, little one, Beth called from the garden, where she knelt among rows of new vegetables. The kitchen garden had been her project this spring, carved out of prairie grass with the help of willing ranch hands who couldn't refuse Mrs. Hartley anything. Samuel watched his daughter's unsteady pursuit of the butterfly, ready to catch her if she fell, but letting her explore. It was a metaphor for how his life had changed, still protective, still careful, but no longer afraid of life's possibilities. Mr. Hartley. Jake's voice carried across the yard. Riders coming? Looks like the Hendersons. Samuel's smile faded slightly. Their neighbors had been cold since the water rights dispute. Colder still since the child welfare investigation they'd likely instigated. But as the riders drew closer, he saw something unexpected in their faces: humility. Samuel. Robert Henderson dismounted. Hat in hand, his wife Sarah remained on her horse, but her usual stern expression had softened. We've come to... that is, Sarah has something to say. Sarah Henderson looked uncomfortable but determined. We were wrong, she said simply. About you, about your wife, about... She gestured toward Hope, who had abandoned her butterfly to hide behind her father's legs, peeking out at the strangers. What changed your mind? Samuel asked, genuinely curious. Our Mary took fever last month, Robert explained. Bad. Doc Morrison was treating folks in Billings. Couldn't come. We were desperate and... He paused, clearing his throat. Your wife came, middle of the night, in the rain. Stayed 3 days, nursing Mary through the worst of it. Samuel turned to look at Beth, who had risen from her garden, brushing dirt from her apron. She met his gaze steadily, a slight shrug saying what words wouldn't it was the right thing to do. She wouldn't take payment, Sarah continued. Said neighbors help neighbors, regardless of past differences. Said she knew what it was like to fear for a child. The woman's voice broke slightly. We judged you both harshly. I'm sorry for it. Hope, deciding the strangers weren't threats, toddled out from behind Samuel's legs. She looked up at Sarah's horse with bright curiosity. Horsey. Despite herself, Sarah smiled. Yes, little one, a horse. She looked at Samuel. She's beautiful. Has your eyes. It was an olive branch, and Samuel recognized it. She has her mother's spirit, he said, lifting Hope so she could pet the horse's nose. Would you like to come in for coffee? Beth's been baking. The Hendersons exchanged glances. Then Robert nodded. We'd be obliged. As Beth served coffee and fresh bread in the kitchen that had once known only silence and beans. Samuel watched the careful dance of reconciliation. Sarah complimented the bread. Beth asked after Mary's recovery. Robert admired the improvements to the house. Hope, oblivious to the adults' careful diplomacy, charmed everyone by offering her wooden blocks to each guest in turn. You've built something good here, Sarah said finally, watching Hope stack blocks with intense concentration. The whole county's talking about it, not gossip, she added quickly. Admiration. A man who saved a widow and her baby, who opened his home and heart when most would have sent her away. Beth saved me, Samuel said quietly, reaching for his wife's hand. I was the one frozen in winter. She brought the spring. After the Hendersons left with promises of reciprocal visits and shared harvests, Samuel found himself walking through his house with new eyes. The parlor, once dusty and closed, now held Beth's sewing basket and Hope's toys. The dining room hosted regular meals instead of standing empty. Even his study showed signs of life, Hope's drawings tacked to the wall. Beth's knitting in a basket by the fire. You're thinking deep thoughts, Beth observed, finding him in the doorway of what had once been Emma's room. Now, Hope's nursery. I'm thinking about time. He admitted. How I spent 3 years trying to stop it, preserve everything exactly as it was, and how you and Hope made it move again. She slipped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her cheek against his back. Time moves, whether we want it or not. The choice is whether we move with it or stand still while it passes us by. That evening, the ranch hands gathered for their weekly dinner at the main house, another change Beth had instituted. The dining room filled with rough voices and laughter as men who worked hard all week cleaned up for the chance to eat at a real table with a real family. Old Pete bounced Hope on his knee, teaching her a counting song. Jake debated cattle prices with Samuel. The younger hands competed for Beth's attention, telling exaggerated stories of their week's adventures. It was loud, chaotic, and utterly alive. "Remember when this place was quiet as a tomb?" Jake murmured to Samuel as they watched the controlled chaos. "Barely," Samuel admitted, and it was true. The silent years felt like a dream now, or a nightmare faded by morning light. Later, after the hands had returned to the bunkhouse and Hope was asleep, Samuel and Beth sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The spring evening was mild, carrying the scent of growing things and possibility. "I've been thinking," Beth said carefully. "Hope should have a brother or sister. Children need company, especially out here." Samuel's hand found hers in the darkness. "Are you—" "Not yet, but I'd like to be, if you're willing." He thought of sleepless nights and worried days, of the terror and joy of raising children in this hard country. Then he thought of Hope's laughter, of teaching another child to ride, of filling this big house with enough love and noise to banish any lingering ghosts. "I'm willing," he said, pulling her close, "for whatever comes." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch cattle lowing in the distance, horses nickering in the barn, the old house settling around them like a contented sigh. It was the sound of home, real and lived in, no longer a monument to loss, but a testament to life's persistence. "Do you ever think about him?" Samuel asked suddenly. "Thomas?" "Every day," Beth answered without hesitation. "But not with pain anymore. With gratitude, for the time we had, for hope, for the path that led me here." She turned to look at him. "Do you think about Martha and Emma?" "Yes, but differently now." He struggled to find the right words. "They're not ghosts haunting empty rooms anymore. They're part of the foundation, part of what made me capable of loving again." A coyote called in the distance, answered by another, then another, until the night filled with their wild song. Hope would wake soon, wanting comfort or water or simply reassurance that her parents were near. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, calves to brand, fences to mend, meals to cook, a garden to tend. But tonight, Samuel Hartley sat with his wife on the porch of a house that had learned to laugh again, and knew himself to be the richest man in the territory. Not because of his cattle or his land or his bank accounts, but because a desperate widow had arrived in a snowstorm and taught him the greatest truth of all. Life wasn't about surviving winters. It was about having the courage to plant in spring, to trust that love could grow in the most unlikely ground, and to open your heart wide enough to let hope take root. "I love you," he said, words that had once come so hard now flowing easily as water. "And I love you," Beth replied, leaning into his warmth. "My unexpected blessing, my second chance." Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to human sorrow or joy. But in the ranch house beneath them, two people who had thought their best days behind them held tight to the present and faced the future without fear, knowing that together they could weather any storm. In her crib, Hope stirred but didn't wake, dreaming baby dreams of butterflies and horses and parents whose love had built a bridge across grief to find joy on the other side. And somewhere in the Montana night, spring continued its ancient work of bringing life from what seemed dead, hope from what seemed hopeless, and love from the most unexpected places. The millionaire rancher who had hired a cook had received so much more. A wife, a daughter, a family, a future. And the pregnant widow who had arrived with nothing had found everything: safety, love, belonging, and the profound truth that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as its greatest challenges. As for what tomorrow would bring, neither worried overmuch. They had learned the secret that life wasn't about avoiding pain or loss, but about having someone to share both sorrow and joy, someone to hold your hand through the storms and dance with you in the sunshine. And that, in the end, was worth more than all the gold in the mountains or all the cattle on the plains. It was worth everything. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect with fellow story lovers from around the world. If you enjoyed this tale of love and hope in the Wild West, please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts. What touched your heart the most? What would you like to hear next? Your comments inspire new stories, and I read every single one. Until the next time, keep believing in second chances and the power of love to transform even the coldest winter into spring.